Number 1. Josefa Segovia. On the morning of July 5, 1851, Frederick Cannon, an Australian miner known for his Herculean build, was found dead inside Josefa Segovia's adobe cabin in Downeyville, California. A single Bowie knife had been driven through his sternum and into his heart, producing a clean puncture wound that caused instantaneous death with minimal external bleeding. Cannon's body lay where it fell after he had forced his way toward the doorway during a confrontation that began the previous night. Segovia, a 25-year-old Mexican woman also recorded as Juanita or Josefa Loaiza, stood over him still holding the blade. Her common-law husband, Jose, had been present for the final exchange. No formal autopsy was performed. The cause of death was established on site by the crowd that gathered within minutes. The sequence opened on July 4 during Downeyville's first statehood 4th of July celebration. Parades and speeches had given way to widespread drinking among the miners. Cannon and several companions, all intoxicated, forced entry into Segovia's cabin while Jose was absent. Contemporary records from the Marysville Daily Herald and the steamer Pacific Star state that Cannon kicked down the door, created a disturbance, and directed profanities at Segovia. She repelled the intruders, and they left. Early the next morning, Cannon returned, reportedly to apologize or to resume the quarrel. Jose confronted him outside the cabin. Cannon followed them back inside, exchanged words in Spanish, and called both Segovia and Jose names. When Cannon attempted to re-enter the house a second time, Segovia plunged the Bowie knife into his chest. Jose's later testimony, given under duress at the street trial, confirmed the sequence. Cannon had used abusive language and advanced on the doorway immediately before the strike. News of the killing spread through the mining camp within an hour. A mob of Anglo-American miners dragged Segovia from refuge at a local gambling house and placed both her and Jose under informal arrest. No law enforcement officers were involved. Downeyville operated under the extra-legal miners' code that governed most gold rush settlements. By midday, the crowd had convened an ad hoc trial in the open street. A jury composed entirely of Cannon's fellow miners heard testimony for less than 2 hours. Jose repeated his account of the name-calling and the attempted re-entry. Other witnesses described the knife wound exactly as it appeared, a single thrust through the sternum, no defensive injuries on Cannon's hands, and no signs of prolonged struggle. Segovia offered no formal defense beyond stating that Cannon had provoked the act. A local physician, Cyrus D. Aiken, stepped forward to testify that Segovia was 3 months pregnant. The crowd immediately shouted him down, drove him from the stand, and ordered him out of town. He remained absent for several days out of fear for his safety. A San Francisco lawyer who attempted to argue for a formal trial and to question whether murder had in fact been committed was similarly assaulted, kicked off the makeshift platform, and told to leave Downeyville within 24 hours. The jury deliberated for minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Jose was acquitted of any role in the killing, but instructed to depart the camp the same day. Segovia received a sentence of death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 hours. Workers erected a scaffold on the Jersey Bridge spanning the Yuba River. The structure consisted of a simple plank platform and a rope suspended from the bridge timbers. At the appointed hour, Segovia was led to the site. She walked with a steady gait and showed no visible signs of distress. According to multiple eyewitnesses, she pushed back 2 plaits of her hair, adjusted the noose around her own neck, and spoke her final words, "I would do the same thing again if so provoked." Some accounts also record her adding a dice, sores, before the drop. The rope was cut at approximately 2 p.m. Her body fell 4 feet and remained suspended, while hundreds of spectators watched from the riverbanks. Death was confirmed by strangulation. No further investigation occurred. The miners' tribunal produced no written transcripts, no chain of custody for the knife, and no medical examiner's report beyond the visible chest wound. Segovia's pregnancy was acknowledged only in the dismissed physician's statement and was never entered into any official record. The event was condemned the following week by the Daily Alta California as a blot upon the history of the state, citing the absence of due process and the mob's refusal to weigh self-defense claims. Segovia's remains were buried locally, later floods disturbed the cemetery, and rumors circulated that her skull was taken as a trophy by a Sierra City men's club. Jose left Downeyville as ordered and disappears from the historical record. Frederick Cannon was interred in the same cemetery. Josefa Segovia was the first and only woman executed by hanging in California history. The lynching took place on July 5, 1851, under the authority of a vigilante jury that accepted the fatal knife wound as conclusive proof of murder and ignored all contradictory testimony. The case file consists solely of contemporaneous newspaper dispatches and the recollections of participants. No state or federal court ever reviewed the proceedings. Number 2. Juanita the Duchess. On April 14, 1940, the body of 19-year-old Robert Sherrard was recovered from the Sacramento River beneath the Freeport Bridge south of Sacramento. He wore only swimming trunks. The autopsy performed by the Sacramento County coroner established the cause of death as chloral hydrate poisoning, combined with blunt force trauma to the head and neck. There was no water in the lungs and no evidence of drowning. Sherrard had been rendered unconscious in a Sacramento hotel room the previous evening, beaten while comatose, stripped, redressed in the trunks, driven to the bridge, and thrown over the railing. The clothes he had worn earlier that day were piled neatly on the riverbank to simulate a suicide or accidental drowning. The chloral hydrate had been mixed into his whiskey by Juanita Spinelli, known to her gang as the Duchess. Spinelli, born Evelita Juanita Spinelli on October 17, 1889, in Kentucky, had arrived in San Francisco in January 1940 with her common-law husband, Michael Simeone, and her 3 children. She operated from an apartment in the Fillmore district, training a crew of young male delinquents in robbery, assault, and car theft. The gang included Albert Ives, age 23, Gordon Hawkins, age 21, and Sherrard himself, who had recently been released from a home for the feeble-minded. Spinelli supplied the weapons, kept the proceeds, and issued the orders. On April 8, 1940, Ives and another associate robbed a barbecue stand at Lincoln Way and La Playa in San Francisco. Owner Leland S. Cash, partially deaf, reached for his hearing aid during the holdup. Ives shot him in the stomach. Cash collapsed in the parking lot and died. Sherrard witnessed the shooting and began talking openly about it in the days that followed. By April 13, the gang had fled to Sacramento and taken rooms in a hotel near the river. Spinelli decided Sherrard had become a liability. She obtained chloral hydrate, mixed it into a cup of whiskey, and handed it to him during a gathering in the room. Sherrard drank it and lost consciousness within minutes. Simeone and Spinelli then beat him, Simeone striking him repeatedly in the body and face, Spinelli hitting him in the back of the neck. Ives later testified that Spinelli described the act as merciful because she liked the boy. Once Sherrard was limp, the men dressed him in swimming trunks, carried him to a stolen car, and drove to the Freeport Bridge. Hawkins and Ives lifted him over the railing and dropped him into the water. They placed his folded street clothes on the bank before driving away. The body surfaced the next morning. Sacramento police recovered it and noted the absence of drowning indicators at once. No immediate arrests followed. The gang continued north toward Reno, planning additional robberies and, according to Ives, discussing whether to eliminate him next by pushing him off a cliff near Truckee. On April 14, Ives walked away from the group near Grass Valley, contacted the California Highway Patrol, and surrendered. He provided a full confession, naming Spinelli as the organizer of both the Cash killing and the Sherrard murder. He led officers to the gang's location in Truckee, where Spinelli, Simeone, Hawkins, and Spinelli's 2 young sons were taken into custody. A ballistics test later matched the pistol recovered from Spinelli's purse, bearing her fingerprints to the bullet that killed Cash, though the Sacramento trial focused exclusively on Sherrard's death. Spinelli, Simeone, and Hawkins were charged with first-degree murder in Sacramento County Superior Court. Ives was tried separately and found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to Mendocino State Hospital. The prosecution presented Ives's detailed testimony, the coroner's autopsy report confirming death prior to immersion, and physical evidence including the drugged whiskey residue and the staged clothing. Spinelli took the stand in her own defense. She admitted pouring the chloral hydrate but insisted the killing had been forced on her. "I kind of liked that boy and wanted it to be a mercy killing," she told the jury. "I agreed and put the drops in his whiskey." She claimed Ives had threatened her daughter Lorraine unless she cooperated in making blackjacks and supplying guns. Cross-examination established that Spinelli had directed the disposal of the body and had kept the gang's arsenal in her possession. The jury deliberated briefly and returned guilty verdicts against all three defendants on the charge of premeditated murder. Each received a death sentence. Appeals were filed immediately. Between June and November 1941, Spinelli's execution was scheduled 3 times and stayed each time by Governor Colbert Olson, who cited the absence of any prior legal execution of a woman in California. Petitions from death row inmates at San Quentin and from outside advocates argued that the state should preserve its record. All appeals were denied. On November 21, 1941, Spinelli was transferred from Tehachapi Women's Prison to San Quentin. She ate a last meal of hamburger and turkey the day before, at 10:25 a.m. She walked unaided into the gas chamber wearing a prison dress with photographs of her 3 children and a grandson pinned above the heart. She sat in the designated chair without assistance. The cyanide pellets were dropped into the acid bath. She was pronounced dead 11 minutes later. Michael Simeone and Gordon Hawkins were executed in the same chamber 1 week afterward. Juanita Spinelli was the first woman executed by the state of California. The case file contained the coroner's report showing chloral hydrate levels sufficient to cause rapid unconsciousness, the absence of water in the victim's lungs, and the signed confession of the sole surviving participant who had carried out her instructions. No further review occurred after the sentences were carried out. Number 3. Louise Peete. On December 20th, 1944, the decomposed body of 60-year-old Margaret Logan was exhumed from a shallow grave in the backyard of her Pacific Palisades home, directly beneath an avocado tree and framed by a low mound of earth edged with flower pots and brick. The autopsy performed by the Los Angeles County coroner established the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, producing 2 depressed skull fractures, preceded by a single .32 caliber gunshot wound to the back of the neck. The bullet had struck the 4th cervical vertebra, but missed the spinal cord and lodged in the living room wall 38.5 inches above the floor. Carbon particles embedded 2 inches inside the entry wound indicated the muzzle had been pressed directly against the skin. Blood and strands of human hair matching Logan's were found on the revolver butt, which fit precisely into the cranial defects. No defensive wounds appeared on Logan's hands or arms, and the absence of bite marks contradicted later claims that her husband had attacked her. Louise Peete, born Louise Judson on September 20, 1880, had been paroled from San Quentin in April 1939 after serving 18 years of a life sentence for the 1920 murder of mining engineer Jacob C. Denton. Denton's body had been discovered bound and wrapped in a quilt inside a basement cubicle at Pete's rented Los Angeles mansion, shot once in the back of the head. Peete had forged Denton's checks, withdrawn cash from his accounts, and told neighbors he had been shot by a mysterious Spanish woman and was recovering in seclusion. The Logan case repeated the pattern. Logan, a real estate broker and aircraft plant worker, had helped Peete secure parole and later employed her as a live-in housekeeper. By early 1944, Peete had assumed control of the household finances while Logan's husband, Arthur Logan, exhibited signs of senility. In November 1943, Peete, posing as Arthur's sister, had him committed to a psychiatric hospital. The murder occurred on the evening of May 29, 1944. Peete later testified that she returned from an errand to find Arthur in a rage, biting and beating his wife. She claimed she separated the couple, locked Arthur on the back porch, administered 4 sleeping tablets to Logan, and then heard 2 shots while kneeling in the living room. Pete stated she washed blood from Logan's body, cleaned the scene, and buried the corpse that same night to avoid suspicion tied to her prior conviction. She admitted forging Logan's signature on a $200 check deposited into a joint account and on monthly parole reports submitted to the state. She also forged a power of attorney and deeds of gift transferring Logan's property to herself. Neighbors observed Pete repainting the house, remodeling furniture, wearing Logan's clothing, driving Logan's car, and opening her mail within days of the disappearance. When questioned about Logan's absence, Pete told one neighbor that Logan had gone to Santa Monica for plastic surgery to repair bite wounds inflicted by Arthur. To another, she said Logan had traveled to Oregon. To police, she described a sanitarium near Patton. Suspicion arose when a parole officer noticed irregularities in the forged reports. On December 20th, 1944, Los Angeles police and sheriff's deputies arrived at the Pacific Palisades address. A slight rise in the garden soil prompted a search. Police chemist Ray Pinker identified the mound, ordered minimal excavation, and uncovered the body. Pete was arrested at the scene. During a 3-hour interrogation with Sheriff Jean Biscailuz, she first insisted Logan remained alive and undergoing surgery, then admitted burying the corpse but maintained Arthur had committed the killing. Confronted with the revolver, stolen from deceased parole officer Emily Latham and initialed E. Beale, Pete refused to handle it on the witness stand, stating only, "I will not take that gun up in my hand." She told Captain Thad Brown she wanted to speak solely to Biscailuz, because Jean Biscailuz told me someday I'd blow my top again. Pete's third murder trial opened in Los Angeles Superior Court on April 23, 1945. Prosecutors introduced the .32 caliber Smith & Wesson recovered from her bedroom drawer, the bullet fragment from the living room wall, blood and hair analysis, and the coroner's reconstruction placing the shot at the telephone stand. The prior Denton conviction was admitted to demonstrate a continuing plan of gaining access to a victim's home, forging documents, fabricating stories about the victim's whereabouts, and burying the body on the premises. Pete testified for the defense, repeating the Arthur and Rage narrative and claiming she had heard multiple shots despite only 1 bullet being recovered and no ricochet marks on the floor or rug. Cross-examination exposed contradictions, no teeth marks on Logan's body, no hammer impressions on the skull, and the revolver butt's perfect fit into the fractures. The jury of 11 women and 1 man deliberated and returned a first-degree murder verdict on May 31, 1945. Judge Harold B. Landreth sentenced Pete to death the following day, ordering her delivered to San Quentin for execution by lethal gas. All appeals were denied by the California Supreme Court on June 7, 1946. Pete remained at Tehachapi Women's Prison until April 10, 1947, when she was transferred to San Quentin. On the morning of April 11, she entered the gas chamber at 10:03 a.m., wearing the same brown print dress she had worn throughout the trial. She smiled and nodded to Warden Clinton Duffy through the observation window, then sat in the chair without assistance. Cyanide pellets dropped into the sulfuric acid at 10:03 a.m. She was pronounced dead at 10:13 a.m. After 10 minutes of inhalation. Louise Pete was the second woman executed by the state of California. The case file contained the coroner's report matching the revolver to both the bullet wound and the skull fractures, the forged financial documents, and Pete's own admission that she had buried the body while continuing to draw on Logan's accounts and impersonate her in official correspondence. No further review occurred after the sentence was carried out. Number 4. Barbara Graham. On December 21, 1958, the body of 28-year-old Olga Duncan was exhumed from a shallow grave dug less than 2 feet deep along Highway 150 in Ventura County, California, near the future site of Casitas Reservoir off Casitas Pass Road. She lay face up in the loose soil with her arms at her sides. The autopsy conducted by the Ventura County pathologist established the cause of death as manual strangulation, preceded by repeated blunt force trauma to the head and face. The skull showed multiple depressed fractures consistent with pistol whipping severe enough to render the weapon inoperative. Soil particles were embedded in her nostrils and mouth, and the pathologist testified he could not rule out that Olga was still alive when the final layer of dirt was shoveled over her. She had been 7 months pregnant. No ligature marks appeared on the neck beyond finger impressions. The killers had taken turns applying pressure until she stopped moving. Olga Kupchik, a Canadian nurse who had immigrated from Ukraine, met attorney Frank Duncan while caring for his mother at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. They married on June 20th, 1958, without first informing Elizabeth Ann Duncan, then 54. Elizabeth, who had been married at least 10 times and operated a brothel in San Francisco, viewed Olga as a direct threat to her control over Frank. She harassed Olga at St. Vincent's Hospital, followed her to multiple apartments, and cut up Frank's birth certificate and baby photographs. On November 13, 1958, Elizabeth hired 20-year-old Luis Estrada Moya and 25-year-old Agustin Baldonado for $6,000 to kill her daughter-in-law. She paid them nothing. Her bank account held less than $500. On the night of November 17, 1958, Moya and Baldonado drove a rented car to Olga's Garden Street apartment in Santa Barbara. They told her Frank had passed out drunk in the back seat and needed her help. When Olga bent into the vehicle, they struck her across the head with a pistol, shoved her inside, and drove toward Ventura County. En route, one man continued beating her with the gun butt until the weapon broke. Blood soaked the upholstery. The killers later ripped out the entire back seat, door panels, and springs before returning the car. They pulled off the road near Ojai, took turns strangling Olga, and, believing her dead, dragged her body into the brush and buried it in the shallow grave with their hands and a small shovel. Olga's disappearance triggered an immediate missing person report. Santa Barbara detectives noted her purse, wallet, and folded baby clothes left behind in the apartment. Elizabeth Duncan first claimed Olga had abandoned Frank, then obtained a fraudulent annulment by hiring a man to impersonate her son while she impersonated Olga. She had previously approached at least 3 other people to murder Olga, offering cash, acid, or chloroform. On December 21, 1958, Agustin Baldonado, arrested on an unrelated warrant, confessed to Ventura County Sheriff's detectives and led them directly to the grave. Luis Moya was arrested the same day on a parole violation and confessed on Christmas night to a street preacher who contacted authorities. Both men identified Elizabeth Duncan as the person who hired them and supplied the $6,000 figure. Elizabeth Duncan was arrested at the Santa Barbara Police Department after she walked in fearing the hitman would kill her for non-payment. She initially described the matter as a misunderstanding and declined to press charges. Frank Duncan, practicing attorney and son, reduced her bail from $50,000 to $5,000 before going into hiding. The blood-soaked rental car, witness statements from nurses at St. Vincent's Hospital, and landlady accounts of Elizabeth banging on Olga's door completed the chain of evidence. No physical trace of Elizabeth appeared at the grave or apartment, but the hitman's detailed confessions and the pathologist's findings tied the contract killing directly to her. The trial opened in Ventura County Superior Court on February 24, 1959. Moya and Baldonado testified for the prosecution without any promise of leniency. They described luring Olga into the car, the pistol whipping that broke the gun, the alternating strangulation, and the burial. Both stated Olga had fought for her life, and that, had they known she was pregnant, they would not have accepted the contract. Elizabeth took the stand and claimed Moya and Baldonado had attempted to blackmail her after the fact. She admitted plotting to separate Frank from Olga, but denied ordering the murder, stating only, "I didn't want to lose Frankie. I couldn't stand life alone, and I knew it." The jury deliberated 4 hours and 51 minutes before returning guilty verdicts of first-degree murder against all 3 defendants on March 16, 1959. Death sentences were imposed 4 days later. All appeals were denied. Governor Pat Brown, personally opposed to capital punishment, reviewed the clemency petition and allowed the sentences to stand. On August 8, 1962, Elizabeth Duncan, Luis Moya, and Agustin Baldonado were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Duncan was pronounced dead at 10:12 a.m. Moya and Baldonado followed in the same chamber. It was the last triple execution and the last execution of a woman in California history. The case file contained the pathologist's report confirming death by strangulation after pistol whipping, with the possibility the victim was buried alive, the blood evidence from the rented car, the hitman's signed confessions, and Elizabeth Duncan's own admission that she had hired multiple parties to eliminate Olga. No further review occurred after the sentences were carried out. Number 5. Elizabeth Ann. On the morning of March 11, 1953, the gardener of 64-year-old widow Mabel Monahan entered her Burbank home through the ajar front door and found her body on the living room floor. Monahan lay face down, with her hands tied behind her back using strips torn from a bedsheet. A pillowcase had been pulled over her head and secured with another length of cloth knotted around her neck. Blood spatter covered the walls and furniture. The coroner's inquest ruled the cause of death asphyxiation due to strangulation. The autopsy documented 12 separate blunt force wounds to the head that had crushed the skull in 2 distinct locations. Yet those injuries were not fatal. The ligature had produced the lethal compression. No safe or large cash hoard was missing. Because none existed, the robbers had overlooked a purse in the closet containing $474 and jewelry later valued at $15,000. The robbery had occurred 2 nights earlier, on the evening of March 9. Barbara Elaine Graham, then 29, arrived at the front door first and rang the bell. Monahan, who was reading a murder novel, opened it after Graham claimed car trouble and asked to use the telephone. Graham stepped inside. Within seconds, Jack Santo, Emmett Perkins, and John True forced their way in behind her. According to True's testimony, Graham held a nickel-plated revolver, struck Monahan repeatedly across the face and head with the butt, and handed the weapon to Perkins with the order to finish the job. Perkins and Santo dragged the unconscious woman into the hallway while Graham slipped the pillowcase over her head. Santo fastened the final knot around the neck. The 4 ransacked every room searching for the rumored safe belonging to Monahan's former son-in-law, a Las Vegas gambler. They left empty-handed. Graham, Santo, and Perkins were arrested on May 4, 1953, in a Santa Monica hotel after an undercover Los Angeles police officer followed Graham there. She had approached the officer days earlier and asked him to fabricate an alibi placing her elsewhere on the night of March 9. John True turned state's witness in exchange for immunity and provided the detailed account of the entry, the beating, and the strangulation. Baxter Shorter, another participant, gave a separate statement to detectives before disappearing. His body was never recovered, and he was presumed murdered. No fingerprints belonging to Graham were recovered from the scene, no weapon was ever matched to her possession, and no blood or hair evidence directly linked her hands to the wounds. The prosecution relied on True's eyewitness testimony, the undercover officer's recording of the alibi request, and crime scene photographs of the bound hands and ligature that matched the method True described. Graham took the stand and denied participation. When pressed on her movements that night, she snapped at the prosecutor, "Have you ever been desperate? Do you know what it is?" She maintained she had been elsewhere, but could not produce corroborating witnesses after her initial false alibi collapsed. The trial opened in Los Angeles Superior Court on August 18, 1953. Graham, Santo, and Perkins were charged with first-degree murder. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on September 1 with no recommendation for mercy. Each defendant received a death sentence. Appeals were denied. Graham was transferred to San Quentin in the spring of 1955. On June 3rd, 1955, her execution was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but delayed twice by Governor Goodwin Knight. At 10:43, she protested from her holding cell, "Why do they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock." At 11:28, she was led into the gas chamber wearing a prison dress. She requested a blindfold so she would not have to watch the witnesses. Seated and strapped, she was advised that a deep breath after the cyanide pellets dropped would shorten the process. She answered, "How the hell would you know?" Her last spoken words were, "Good people are always so sure they're right." The pellets were released at 11:30. She was pronounced dead 11 minutes later. Santo and Perkins were executed in the same chamber later that day. The case received nationwide publicity and was dramatized in the 1958 film I Want to Live, which portrayed Graham's protestations of innocence. At the time of conviction, the state presented the ligature, the blunt force pattern, and the accomplice testimony as conclusive links to the scene. Barbara Graham was the third woman executed by the state of California. Case file contained the coroner's report, confirming death by the bedsheet ligature, the crime scene photographs of the bound hands and neck, True's sworn statement, and the undercover recording of the alibi solicitation. No further review occurred after the sentences were carried out. Number 6. Michelle Michaud. On December 3, 1997, the body of 22-year-old Vanessa Leigh Sampson was recovered from a snowy embankment beside Highway 88 near Crater Wash in Alpine County, California. She wore the same clothing she had on when she left home to walk to her clerical job at SCJ Insurance Services in Pleasanton. A 6-foot black nylon rope lay nearby, with strands of her dark hair twisted into one end. The autopsy performed by Dr. Curtis Rollins and reviewed by forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson established the cause of death as mechanical asphyxia from ligature strangulation, with additional evidence of manual strangulation. The ligature mark encircled the neck completely. Deep bruising extended into the gluteus maximus, and every muscle of the throat had hemorrhaged. No water or snow was present in the lungs. Sampson's DNA was later matched to swabs taken from 2 modified Revlon curling irons recovered inside a green 1994 Dodge Caravan registered to Michelle Lynn Michaud. Brown material consistent with blood and fecal matter coated the tips of both instruments. Sampson had left her parents' home on Kern Court in Pleasanton between 7:20 and 7:45 a.m. on December 2. 2 roofers working nearby heard a single desperate scream at approximately 7:30 a.m. and watched a forest green Dodge minivan with a light-colored California plate beginning with the numeral 3 pull away slowly. The rear and middle seats had been removed. The interior was fitted with anchor bolts, hooks, and ropes fed through slits cut into the carpet. Michaud, then 43, and her partner James Anthony DiVeggio, 41, had purchased a rubber ball gag and a cassette tape titled Submissive Young Girls the day before at a Livermore adult store. They parked the van near Foothill High School earlier that morning, scouting for victims. Sampson was forced into the sliding side door of the van and bound. The couple drove east on Interstate 80, stopping first at Campsite 9 in Sly Park, where they rented space under DiVeggio's name. Inside the van and later at the Tahoe Sundowner Motel, they penetrated Sampson vaginally and rectally with the altered curling irons whose electrical cords had been cut and clasps removed. Duct tape wrapped the middles for grip. A green ball gag was forced into her mouth. Bite marks and her DNA were later recovered from it. DiVeggio drove while Michaud performed the assaults. After several hours, they continued toward South Lake Tahoe. Near Crater Wash, Michaud strangled Sampson with the nylon rope while DiVeggio held her down. They dumped the body on the embankment and drove on to State Line, Nevada. A trucker spotted the body at 10:45 a.m. the next morning. Pleasanton Police, the FBI, and the Placer County Sheriff's Department opened a joint investigation. Sampson's family had already filed a missing person report after she failed to appear for her 8 a.m. shift. The description of the green van and the partial plate matched Michaud's vehicle exactly. On December 3rd, Michaud and DiVeggio were arrested at the Lakeside Inn and Casino in State Line on an outstanding federal warrant stemming from a September 29, 1997, kidnapping and sexual assault of a Reno Community College student. FBI agent Lynn Farron used a ruse that DiVeggio was ill to separate them. Inside the van, investigators found the modified curling irons bearing Michaud's fingerprints, the ball gag, the black rope, a crossbow, loaded handguns, ammunition, a white towel stained with red material, and the submissive young girl's tape still in the cassette player. Sampson's NA linked every instrument of torture directly to her. During a December 5 interview at the Douglas County Jail, Michaud told FBI agent Christopher Campion she had information about the young lady who was killed a couple of days ago. To a cellmate, she said only, "I'm scared. I'm in a lot of trouble." DiVeggio later testified in the penalty phase that the abduction's primary motive was sexual gratification, and that Michaud had strangled Sampson after they discussed whether to release her. He conceded both curling irons had been used to penetrate the victim. Michaud maintained she acted under DiVeggio's control and suffered from post-traumatic stress. The pair had operated the van as a mobile torture chamber for at least 13 months. They modeled their crimes after Gerald and Charlene Gallego, carrying serial killer trading cards that featured the Gallegos and a book titled Dead of Night. At least 6 other young women had been abducted and assaulted. 2 were relatives of the defendants. Evidence from those uncharged incidents was admitted at trial to prove intent, plan, and identity. Michaud and DiVeggio were charged in Alameda County Superior Court with first-degree murder, kidnapping, rape by instrument, and 2 counts of oral copulation in concert by force involving additional victims. The trial began in February 2002. Prosecutors presented the van's interior modifications, the DNA matches, the ligature rope with Sampson's hair, and the curling irons as conclusive physical proof. On May 6, 2002, the jury convicted both defendants of first-degree murder with special circumstances of kidnapping and rape by instrument. After 2 days of penalty phase deliberation, the jury returned death verdicts on June 13. On September 25, 2002, Judge Larry Goodman formally sentenced Michaud and DiVeggio to death, describing the slaying as vile, cruel, senseless, depraved, brutal, evil, and vicious. At sentencing, DiVeggio stated, "I in fact did not kill Miss Sampson. By law, I am as guilty of her death as Michelle is." Michaud offered no statement on advice of counsel. All direct appeals were denied. On April 26, 2018, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld the convictions and death sentences in a 98-page opinion, rejecting claims of evidentiary error, improper admission of uncharged offenses, and due process violations. Michelle Michaud remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, one of 23 women among the state's condemned inmates. No execution date has been set. The case file contains the autopsy report confirming ligature and manual strangulation, and fingerprint evidence tying the modified curling irons and ball gag to Sampson inside Michaud's specially equipped van, the signed statements of both defendants, and the jury's special circumstance. No further review has altered the sentences.
Number 7, Angelina Rodriguez.
On September 9, 2000, at 3:19 a.m., Montebello police officer Stephen Sharp responded to 837 Marconi Street and found 41-year-old Jose Francisco Rodriguez, a special education teacher, lying face down on the bedroom carpet with blood coming from his nose. No trauma was visible, and no immediate cause of death appeared. Rodriguez's wife, Angelina Rodriguez, identified the body and cried in a manner the officer later described as rehearsed or forced, with audible noise but no tears. She snapped out of the crying instantly when questioned. The initial autopsy and standard toxicology screen revealed nothing. The death was ruled undetermined. Hours after the body was removed, Angelina called the life insurance company to inquire about the $250,000 policy she had taken out on Frank 3 months after their April 2000 marriage, but the agent told her no payout could occur until the coroner established a cause. The couple had met while working at a camp in San Luis Obispo. Within months, Angelina began complaining to friends about marital problems and openly discussed killing Frank for the insurance money rather than divorcing him. She first fed him tea brewed from boiled oleander leaves, sending him to the emergency room on an earlier date with severe stomach illness diagnosed as food poisoning. She then loosened the gas cap on their clothes dryer in an attempt to produce carbon monoxide poisoning before leaving town to visit a friend. Finally, she spiked multiple bottles of Gatorade with shots of green antifreeze and had Frank and their daughter nurse him with the liquid every 4 hours after he woke ill on September 6. Toxicology later confirmed he received a massive dose of ethylene glycol 4 to 6 hours before death. The chemical had seeped from his eyes post-mortem. Oleander toxins were also present in his system. Angelina called an investigator and claimed she had received an anonymous cell phone call suggesting antifreeze poisoning. Cell phone records proved no such call existed. She told the same investigator the poison might have come from the flowers on the road. You know they grow in the middle of the highway, referring to oleander plants growing near their patio. When the coroner still listed the cause as undetermined, she pushed for additional specific testing, stating only that it was necessary to obtain a death certificate and settle the insurance claim. The expanded toxicology panel returned positive for lethal levels of ethylene glycol and oleander. No antifreeze containers were found in the house, but the green liquid's presence matched the color and chemical profile of the antifreeze she had purchased earlier. Investigators obtained wiretapped recordings in which Angelina discussed using what I killed my husband with, antifreeze, to eliminate a witness who had heard her earlier murder plans. She fabricated evidence implicating a former co-worker at Angel Gate Academy, telling detectives an anonymous tip pointed to him. Friends testified she had joked about botanical poisons and stated, well, he's got a life insurance policy, I ought to just kill him and get it over with. At Frank's funeral, she appeared relaxed and told his sister, there's lots of things you can use to poison people, botanical things. Oleander, for example. She also told Frank's mother she was pregnant with twins, a claim she had made falsely in prior relationships. Angelina was arrested on February 7, 2001, in Paso Robles. In a later jailhouse interview with forensic psychiatrist William Vickery, she said, I have remorse in my heart. I'm sorry for what happened to Frank, but added, if I admit responsibility, then I'll lose everything. I lose all hope. During trial preparation, she insisted Frank had poisoned himself, asking, how could I have gotten all that green goop into this intelligent man? And later in court, would your wife be able to hand you a cup of antifreeze? She maintained, I don't have remorse for a murder I didn't do. The trial in Los Angeles County Superior Court resulted in conviction in October 2003 for first-degree murder with special circumstances of murder by administering poison and murder for financial gain, plus 1 count of attempting to dissuade a witness. The jury deadlocked on the solicitation to murder count. On January 12, 2004, Judge William R. Pounders sentenced her to death, stating she had killed her husband in an exceptionally cruel and callous way, and that her guilt had been proved to an absolute certainty. He added, in the past 20 years, I have never seen a colder heart. The California Supreme Court upheld the conviction and sentence in 2014. A new penalty phase hearing was ordered in 2010. She was resentenced to death that November. In 2024, the Los Angeles County District Attorney declined to re-seek the death penalty after Angelina claimed ineffective assistance of counsel during the original penalty phase. On October 31, 2024, Judge James R. Dabney re-sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Angelina Rodriguez remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. The case file contains the toxicology reports confirming lethal ethylene glycol and oleander in Frank Rodriguez's system, the insurance policy documents naming her sole beneficiary, cell phone records disproving the anonymous call claim, and the wiretap evidence of her plan to silence the witness with the same poison. No further review has altered the sentence.
Number 8. Socorro Caro.
On November 22, 1999, forensic technicians recovered a pair of blood-soaked women's pajama shorts from the emergency room gurney where Socorro Susan Caro lay after emergency transport from her Santa Rosa Valley home in Camarillo, Ventura County. High-velocity impact spatter on the inner thigh of those shorts matched the blood of her 5-year-old son Christopher, including microscopic droplets projected from a contact gunshot wound to the head. Under her fingernails, scrapings contained DNA from Christopher and her 11-year-old son Joey. Bullet fragments removed from her brain during surgery and bloodstains on the shorts and t-shirt also carried Joey's DNA and a fragment of Christopher's brain matter. Those findings, documented in the Ventura County Sheriff's forensic reports, placed the 44-year-old mother directly in front of the muzzle when the shots were fired. That evening began with dinner at the family's $1 million hilltop house. Xavier Caro, a rheumatologist with an office in Northridge, had returned home around 6:30. Socorro, who managed his medical practice until he fired her 3 months earlier over unauthorized payments to her parents and mounting office debt, drank margaritas with him. Their 11-year-old son Joey complained about the drinking. Xavier removed the television and video game system from Joey's bedroom as discipline. Socorro objected. The argument escalated. Xavier grabbed her shoulders. She slid to the floor. Her mother, Juanita Leon, visiting from out of town, intervened and yelled at Xavier. He left the house around 9 o'clock in his maroon Mercedes, driving the 40-minute route to his office. Phone records later showed Socorro called him repeatedly on his car phone and at the office, crying, agitated, telling him he always knew the difference between right and wrong, and pleading for him to come home. Xavier made one unanswered call back to the house at 9:53. Security footage at the office captured a vehicle matching his arriving at 9:24 and leaving at 10:36. Xavier returned home shortly after 11. He found Socorro on the master bedroom floor in a semi-fetal position, blood-stained froth around her mouth, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver beneath her, and 5 expended shell casings scattered nearby. The gun, which he had bought for her self-defense, had 1 live round left in the cylinder. He called 911 at 11:21, initially reporting a possible overdose or wrist slashing. Then he checked the children's bedrooms. In Joey's room, the boy lay face up in bed, shot once in the head at point-blank range. In the adjacent room shared by 8-year-old Michael and 5-year-old Christopher, Michael was face up, shot once through the head. Christopher had sat up after the first shot missed. He was hit twice. The youngest son, 13-month-old Gabriel, remained unharmed in his crib. Xavier performed CPR on Michael, dislodging skull fragments from the boy's airway before deputies arrived. Socorro was airlifted to Los Robles Regional Medical Center in Thousand Oaks, then transferred to Ventura County Medical Center. Deputies at the scene documented pry marks on the gun-safe door, which opened without the combination. Gunshot residue tests returned positive on the right hands of both Socorro and Xavier. Blood spatter analysis later distinguished the two. Crime scene reconstructionist Rod Englert examined the shorts and t-shirt. He identified high-velocity spatter patterns on the fabric consistent with blowback from contact shots to the children's heads. The inner thigh pattern on the shorts aligned precisely with the shooter standing over Christopher as he sat up in bed. Projected blood and a possible scalp fragment adhered to the material. Bloody handprints on the doorjamb between Joey's room and the bathroom matched Socorro's prints and contained Joey's blood. Additional stains in the master bathroom carried Joey's DNA. On Xavier's clothing, only transfer stains of Michael's blood appeared. No high-velocity spatter, no projected droplets. Englert testified at trial that the blood distribution on Socorro's garments proved she wore them while firing the shots that killed Christopher and at least one other son. The absence of similar patterns on Xavier's jacket excluded him as the shooter. The next afternoon, November 23rd, Detective Cheryl Wade interviewed Socorro in the ICU. She remained intubated, sedated, with a head drain and fresh surgical incisions from the removal of bullet and bone fragments. The interview, recorded and lasting nearly 3 hours on and off, captured Socorro drifting in and out of consciousness, repeatedly stating that her head, neck, and fractured foot hurt. Wade asked about the swollen, bruised right foot. Socorro replied she might have fallen down the stairs or been hurt while wrestling with a boy. She claimed no memory of the previous night. When her mother Juanita was brought in, Socorro said, "My babies. My babies. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Later, she told Wade, "I'm sorry for what happened to my babies." After Miranda warnings were finally administered, she invoked her right to counsel. A week later, surgeons repaired the Luz-Franck fracture in her foot, which forensic pathologists attributed to a twisting fall consistent with the recoil and movement inside the house after the shootings. Autopsies confirmed the boys died from single or double contact gunshot wounds to the head. Joey had been shot while lying face down initially. According to Englert's trajectory reconstruction, Michael faced up, Christopher sat up after the first round. No defensive wounds appeared on any child. The medical examiner recovered no foreign material inconsistent with the .38 revolver. Toxicology showed Socorro had been taking Prozac and an anti-anxiety medication prescribed by Xavier. Prosecutors argued the killings were premeditated revenge against her husband amid their collapsing marriage, his affair, her firing, financial disputes, and her fear of poverty. The defense contended Xavier had killed the children, staged the scene, and shot Socorro to frame her. They highlighted the 40-minute drive time, a white truck seen near the hospital parking lot around 10:25, and Xavier's history of physical altercations with Socorro. But the blood spatter, handprints, fingernail DNA, and timing of the office security footage contradicted the frame-up theory. No high-velocity spatter appeared on Xavier's clothes. His hands showed only transfer blood, not blowback. Investigators collected the cut-off clothing from the backboard in the emergency room under plain view after a deputy arrived at the hospital. During surgery, medical staff independently removed fingernail scrapings and bullet fragments. Those items were later handed to detectives present in the operating room wearing scrubs. All physical evidence was admitted at trial. Socorro's initial statements in the ICU were also allowed after the trial court ruled she was not in custody for Miranda purposes at the start of the questioning. The 4-month trial in Ventura County Superior Court ended with a jury of 10 women and 2 men deliberating 5 days before convicting Socorro on 3 counts of first-degree murder on November 6, 2001. The sanity phase lasted another week. The jury rejected her not guilty by reason of insanity plea. In the penalty phase, jurors heard evidence of Socorro's prior violent acts against Xavier and others. On December 10, 2001, they returned a death verdict. Judge Donald Coleman sentenced her to death on April 5, 2002, describing the murders as willful, premeditated, and committed with malice aforethought in the sanctity of the children's bedrooms. He denied the defense motion for a new trial. The California Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction and death sentence on June 13, 2019, finding the forensic evidence overwhelming, even if any hospital statements had been excluded. Socorro Susan Caro, now 68 years old, remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla.